Thanks so much for joining for this bond webinar today on Tuesday, and got quite a few people joining. I'm sure others will join along this next sort of hour and a half that we have all together. So I'm Swati Deepak. I'm based in London in the UK. I'm a board member of 2 philanthropic organisations and work as a consultant across the philanthropic and development sector and space. And I'm really excited and honoured to chair this discussion this morning about challenging the NGO funding landscape, and have alongside me 3 incredible panelists who are filled with wisdom and beautiful smiles. And I'm looking forward to hear more from them about this overarching question on challenging the NGO funding landscape. I will be introducing them properly as we dive into the question and answers, but I'm joined with Purity, who is the Witham 4 Girls Director at Purposeful. She's waving to you from Nairobi. Soha Abdelrazek, who's the Interim Programs Manager at Global Giving and is based in the UK. And then Lucrecia Puentes from the START Network, and she's the new financing team leader there, and she's also joining from the UK. So I think just to set the scene for this session and what you can expect over the next hour and a half is really, I think, when Bond were conceiving this funding week, they were really looking at the fact that, you know, this year has meant so much huge shifts and change around the NGO landscape in the philanthropic sector as well. You know, COVID-19 and the effects of this pandemic have really, you know, laid bare the injustices that are in the world, but how much they can be exacerbated by such a pandemic. And I think all of us have seen through our work just how much more vulnerable the populations that we all work with and serve are being further impacted by this ongoing pandemic. I think also you've seen the Black Lives Matters and the racial justice uprisings sort of ripple through the world with bigger questions just around community accountability, a reckoning of racism within our sector and space, and kind of more opening of questions around power. And I think what it's been really interesting to see as well is that, you know, the funding landscape has changed in many ways quite dramatically over the, you know, since the pandemic started at the beginning of this year. I think more funders have given unrestricted funding, have given to local communities, you know, no cost extensions have been easily given, renewals of funding have been more easily given. There have been a number of different donor collaborations that have sprung up to respond to this moment. And I think more and more funders are noticing, larger funders are noticing that intermediaries and reaching the community is something that is of utmost importance, and trying to find strategies around it. I think as individuals in our communities, we've also seen a rise in people donating to food banks, getting involved and donating through mutual aid societies and unions across the world. And we're really seeing how international development funding is being transformed by new players, by new movements, new networks, new collaboratives. The question around participatory grant making has become more and more pertinent, I think, because of a greater need for community accountability and a shift of power to communities. And so I'm really excited to have 3 incredible panelists and experts in these different varying approaches. So Purity, I'm going to come to you first. So Purity, as I mentioned, is based in Nairobi in Kenya. She is the director of Witham 4 Girls at Purposeful, which is a movement building hub. She's a feminist activist and storyteller, and she's passionate about nurturing girls' freedom and agency, gender equality, as well as enabling girls and young women to access spaces to advance themselves and their communities. She also serves as an advisory member of the East Africa Girls Brain Trust, has been a founding advisory committee member of Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, and was previously the executive director of Akili Dada. So Purity, one other thing to say is that Purity and I overlapped for a little bit of time. So I am a huge fan of Purity. I think what the lens that you bring, the experience that you bring, but most importantly, your sort of passion and insight is so valuable for this sector that we're in. Purity, I wonder if you could tell, the people that are on this webinar a little bit more about your insights in overseeing both the With and For Girls Collective, but also the newly formed Global Resilience Fund as well, and really what your thoughts are around donor collaboratives and participatory grant making and other reflections that you have, and how the funding environment and landscape is being shaped by these new ways of moving money and coming together in collaborative formations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Swati. And it's so good to see you and to be with you again. It's been a while since you left With and For Girls. And I think what Swati is not mentioning is I succeeded her as the director of With and For Girls, where she had been from the founding of the organization. And it's been such a pleasure for me to just build on the legacy that you left at With and For Girls. So the With and For Girls Collective is a collaboration between 11 funders that was started in 2011 and has been recognizing extraordinary girl-led and girl-centered organizations and groups from across the world. And how previously we've done that is through an award system where organizations were nominated to be part of With and For Girls, and they received a grant, that's an award really, that was also a grant, and it was in form of money as well as accompaniment through mentorship, visibility building, as well as connecting the groups that already came to be part of With and For Girls collective. And the collective so far, this year we spent a lot of time just rethinking our strategy and listening to girls and what they wanted. And some of the things we've been learning in that listening as we are doing our new strategic plan is actually just looking at our own data and having a moment of reflection and asking ourselves, in the last 5-6 years that we've been giving awards to a girl-centered organization, where has the money gone? And what sorts of organizations did we end up funding? What are the girls saying about the groups, or where the money went? Did the money serve the girls? Did the money reach to the girls directly? And one of the very interesting and humbling things that we've been learning is actually that a chunk of our funding went to, yes, girl-centered organizations, but they were led by women. And based on just our own criteria of how we set up from the beginning, it was that organizations that could apply into With and For Girls had to have a budget of at least $17,000 and a ceiling of $500,000. And in just looking at that, we realized that if we truly were to reflect what our name says, that we are With and For Girls, majority of the organizations and collectives led by girls do not have those sorts of budgets. So this has been a really humbling year for us to just think through, what does it mean to truly fund girls and center them in the work that we are doing? And one of the things we've come up with as a result of that thinking and reflection, and really wanting to respond to girls in the ways that girls want us to respond to them, has been to actually work on lowering our entry point to who is it that we end up funding. One of the things we've done around that is to remove our funding process, which first came through a nomination process. An organization had to be nominated, then they had to submit an application, which then we constituted a group of girls and then some of the funders in the collective to sit in a panel and evaluate which of the groups that we received would end up receiving funding. So we have removed one aspect of that, that's the application process, especially just in this time of COVID. Just realizing that a lot of girl-led groups do not have access to the internet sometimes, or they are hosted by organizations that have had to close down due to the pandemic. So some of the things we've done around that is just remove that and say groups can we simplified our own application process. So we just have like 5 questions that groups have to respond to, and they are very short and brief. And then groups can be nominated by, they can apply by themselves, or they can be nominated by any women's fund from across the world. And we've also lowered that to the point that even though a group is very new and is not known to any women's fund, they can be nominated by, say, an organization, say in Mongolia, that has received money from a women's fund. They can nominate that group to apply into our process. And as a result of that, we have the last couple of months, we've received over 1,500 applications. And it's been very interesting to see that majority of those applications that have come our way are actually from groups led by girls, queer youth, transgender, who are below 30 years. And I mean, it's such a win to see that you can actually find those groups if you put some bits of effort in just listening and going, like, it's sort of forgetting what we are as funders and saying that we're actually going to actively look for groups out there in the ways that those groups want to be looked for. Because I think the way the philanthropic sector is set up, it's always that because groups are looking for funding, it will be them who do a lot of the work to come to our side, to come and find us, to come find someone to nominate them. Then they have to also navigate our very complex application processes. And just being able to remove that, we have seen lots of wins. We've been able to fund so far over 120 groups. By September of this year, we had funded 120 groups through the Resilience Fund, which is a partnership again that we started at Purposeful, that was made up of at least 30 social justice funders from across the world, who all came together and said, we want to put our money together and respond to the COVID pandemic by ensuring that we are actually channeling money to girl-led organizations, youth-led organizations from across the world. And then the thing that we did with the Resilience Fund was to really be clear about listening to what the youth are saying. If they are saying that they feel that, for example, being able to provide food for a group is what they need at this point, we are not going to start asking them, what is the impact, what is the outcome, how are we going to measure, how are we going to, see our return on investment. We removed all those sorts of ways that we've been dealing with groups in the past, and it's been very encouraging, very motivating for ourselves, and even just hearing from the groups, for them just speaking back to us and saying that they have seen that this new way of engaging with them gives them power. We've been able to share our power with the groups that we are funding. We have been able to meet the groups where they are at and at the point of their needs, instead of us having them always come to us. In just running the Resilience Fund, some of the things we've been realizing in the process is that sometimes actually the groups that we want to fund, the girl-led groups and the young women-led groups, sometimes I guess we set out thinking we have all this money that we want to give to these groups, but sometimes they really need like $5,000 every 6 months. But sometimes we will say that our own ways of processing that money ends up being expensive if we are giving little amounts of funding. But at Purposeful and at With and for Girls, we've really been asking ourselves, what does it truly mean to fund girls in the ways that they want? And we have decided to actually respond that if a group says this is what they need, we will do whatever it takes to be able to give them what they need. And part of that, of course, includes being able to navigate the processes of channeling money to some specific countries, which sometimes we know, of course, the way the governments are structured can be problematic for some groups. But we've been doing our homework and going overboard in just ensuring that whether it's finding that partner who receives the money on behalf of the group, because the group is probably unregistered for one reason or another, or being able to send money via Western Union, things we had not necessarily done before, but we're starting to do that just to be able to respond to girls and young women in the ways that they want. And for me, the very critical thing really is that aspect of sharing power, as well as just trusting that girls know what they want. They have been organizing on their own with very little resource. And therefore, if we are able to come in with a bit more resource to help them continue to organize, then we are actually doing what we intended to do in the world as an organization that's set up to do grant making. And lastly, maybe as I conclude, the other thing we've really that is very key to With and for Girls Collective and also the Global Resilience Fund is the aspect of participatory grant making. I think participatory grant making to me again is a lot of power sharing, because that's saying to groups that yes, we have read your application, but we actually want you to come and make a decision on who actually ends up with the funding. I think, thinking about the way the philanthropic sector is set up and just the power that comes with money, being able to say to a group, actually, we trust your opinion and you are going to honor that opinion by funding the groups that you have suggested, is something that I found very liberating in the way we've been operating. And for me, participatory grant making, I have a long history with it as a founding member of FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. And today, actually, as I was thinking about this particular session, I was actually reflecting on the fact that women's funds and feminist funds have been on that vibe of participatory grant making for the last maybe 15, 20 years. And it's very telling to see that these funders want to share power. They want to trust the groups that they fund. They want to acknowledge that even though the grantees are sort of the recipient, something that they can offer that can actually improve our processes. And for us, one of the things we keep doing is actually constituting groups of girls across regions who then sit and they are the ones who make decisions on that particular region on which organizations ends up getting funding. And what that does for the girls is actually starts to make them experts in the philanthropic space, a space that is really closed to girls. It starts to give them that visibility and just some bit of authority in the processes of how grant making is done. And I think the more of us start to trust our grantees and see them as critical parts of how we do our grant making, I think we are actually able to weather a lot of the challenges we face together, because they are on the ground. They know what's going on more than we do. They know what's needed. So then trusting them to improve our processes seems like the most logical next thing to do in our grant making processes.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Purity, for that just wonderfully articulated journey. I think you picked up on so many interesting things for us to think about as the funding landscape is changing. How do we look at sharing more power with communities? I know also there was a question from Vicky just around clarifying what we mean by participatory grant making. And I think just to answer that very broad brush, and we'll also invite Purity to respond in a second as well. But participatory grant making, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is about the process of actually moving the decision making that happens in philanthropy to communities. So they're actually participating within the grant making decisions. And participatory grant making actually is a spectrum. It's not a binary that you're doing it or you're not doing it. There are several different ways and different ways that funders are doing participatory grant making. And we'll invite Purity to share some of her reflections in a second. But Purity, I loved what you said about how can we be sharing power more with communities? How do we remove or simplify the application process? How do we remove measurement? How do we be in deep dialogue and discussion with communities as to what they want as funders and how important that is? And I think I just want to sort of go back to that question just around the participatory grant making, and just to maybe clarify how that works within the Global Resilience Fund and within For Girls. And even if you have like brilliant knowledge of this, both from Achille Dada and from FRIDA as well. But also I think, Purity, there's sort of other questions that we'd love to pick up on, which is, what do you think that this rise of collectives of funders coming together, like With and for Girls or like the Global Resilience Fund funders, What do you think that actually means for NGOs? Is it allowing groups or funders to take more risks? Is it allowing for more accountability to happen between communities? Or what do you really think for, the audience of Bond are a lot of NGOs and INGOs, and what can you say about that sort of new movement of money and what that means for the landscape of NGOs overall? So I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Swati. Maybe to just build on what you said about the participatory grant making by giving an example. So the way our participatory grant making works at With and for Girls and Purposeful is we will put out a call for applications and groups will respond to that. And then we will constitute groups of girls who are below 30 years old, which we are very just specific about in our organization. And we will constitute these groups of up to 5 girls or young women in a particular region. And those groups sit down and evaluate the applications that they have received. So because especially just speaking about the Resilience Fund, where we really haven't had a criteria on what sort of groups, on what things we wanted to fund. We didn't have any theme. It was just based on, we want to help groups or people across the world weather the COVID pandemic in the ways that make sense to them. So whatever applications we received, the only thematic focus was it has to be responding to the COVID pandemic. So when we receive the application, then the groups sit down and they go through the applications, and then each person scores the groups that they have received. And then once they've scored the groups, they sit again as a group and they decide, out of these maybe 20, 30 groups that we've all read the application, which of these groups would the 5 of us agree to give funding to? And then the groups, they end up choosing what they then forward to us, and those are the groups that we end up giving funding to. So in the past, for With and for Girls, what we did is when we received the applications, the funders who are part of the collective would do the initial shortlisting of the groups that we received applications from. And then after that, the groups that have been shortlisted by the funders would then be taken over by the girls panels that we have constituted per region. And then the girls would make the final decision on who ends up receiving the With and for Girls award. We have now removed the aspect of the funder being the first person or the first ones who interact with the applications that we have received from the field or from the applicants. So now we just have the girls coming in from the very beginning. They are the ones who read the applications first, they shortlist, and then we have another panel of girls that then looks at what the first group had shortlisted, and they make the final decision on who ends up receiving the funding. So the participatory is, again, just us saying as funders that we recognize that we are already holding a lot of power as funders, and sometimes we're not also very aware of what's going on the ground. And it also removes things like bias that sometimes I think we tend to fund what is familiar to us, and where we are feeling that we will get return for our money through the impact that this organization is well established. They are very complex M&D framework. We agree on certain things. I think it removes those aspects of the way we've been making grants, because these girls don't know, most of them don't know the framework. They haven't yet gotten to the point where they haven't interacted with the framework, so they will fund good ideas. And I think funders should be funding good ideas, because sometimes we nullify very good ideas because, of course, they're not fitting our frameworks. So for us, it's also a way of just challenging ourselves to break off from that mentality that everything has to fit in our own boxes of how we want to do grant making. And then to your other question, Swati, of what does this shift mean for funders? I feel like it's been a moment of funders looking at ourselves and saying this thing doesn't work. What we've been doing, works for some groups and it doesn't work for other groups. And it's such a good time to just reflect. I think people have been doing lots of reflection, in our personal spaces, and it's very nice to see that coming to our workspaces, and just us even just being able to critique how we've done things in the past and actually seeking to do better. I think that seeking to do better as funders is something that has come out of these moment of it's no longer a moment, it's prolonged period of this pandemic is something that has come out of there. And I do hope that we continue to uphold that, so that we are paying attention to what our grantees are saying, and we are giving them the space to actually, we are building trust. I think in the past, really, there are very few funders who actively went out to build trust. But the moment in time is calling us to build trust with each other, to build trust with the groups and organizations that we work with across the world. And I do think that once we build that trust, then it's possible for groups to come back to us and say, you gave us money for projects, but you are not doing any projects because we are under lockdown. We can't go to those spaces that we had said we would do this. So could we redirect this money to pay salaries? And that salaries, of course, speaks to people being able to pay their bills. It speaks to just personal care, whatever that looks like for an individual or an organization. I think there are things that we have enjoyed as funders that in the past we didn't make available for the people that we funded. And this, whether it's a participatory grant making or the moment that we are in, is actually allowing us to hear from the people that we've been funding and actually extend to them that care and support, because we can't do it anyway. We can do it, and we've seen lots of that, like groups coming back and saying, we actually just want to be able to have a space to meet or be able to read books online with each other, just host a little sort of reading parties with one another. Or we've had groups saying, music is therapy to us, so we want to be able to produce a few songs. And just, finding yourself as a funder actually giving groups money to do that is something that doesn't necessarily happen that often. So I think in that sense, there are more, we have had good moments of listening. For me, listening has been key. Listening, hearing, and responding in the ways the groups are saying they want us to respond to them. And that has removed that part of funders always being seen as the experts in everything, because of course we come with this power of money, of network, of whatnot. We bring that to the groups in ways sometimes that are not very empowering. But I guess what's happening in the world, and just having been parts of participatory grant making processes, for me, the way I see it is that it really levels the ground. And if the funders are embracing it from a place of, I'm not necessarily losing anything by allowing someone else to speak into my process, it actually gives the grantees more autonomy and more courage to speak to power. Because half the time, then we work in that take away that power from our grantees, because we are killing them with reports and frameworks. And once we remove that and actually see them as human beings, then they are able to be human beings with us, and we build better communities and we build better responses to the challenges that we are responding to across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I would kind of completely echo that I think when you've been a part of participatory grant making panels, and particularly with adolescent girls making decisions, they are honestly the best grant makers and reviewers and assessors and evaluators that I've ever had the honor of sitting alongside in grant making decision meetings. So I feel you on that. We don't do that enough in the development space, in the philanthropic space, certainly. Purity, your sort of responses and presentations have sparked off so many different questions in the Q&As that just to say to everyone on the call, we will, after the presentations, be coming back to some of these questions as well. And obviously Purity is here and might want to respond to things in the chat as we move through the other presentations. But I do want to just thank you, Purity, for those really, I think, bold words around making sure that we do really shift power as funders and think about how that's affecting the landscape, but allow our grantees to speak truth to power? And are we as funders also in places ready to receive that, and what we can learn from coming together to sort of initiate and sort of spread that? I'm going to move to Soha from Global Giving. And Soha is the interim programs manager of Global Giving UK. She's a social justice activist, growth strategist, and transformational change coach, and has worked across the global nonprofit sector for over 18 years, getting resources to frontline movements and organizations and individuals, and building on trust-based partnerships. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into this question around what you think is changing the NGO funding landscape. We all know, and for those of you that might not know, Global Giving is this incredible platform where you as individuals or you as funders can get your money directly to lots and lots of different grassroots organizations and movements around the world, and is a fantastic sort of stakeholder within the philanthropic sector. And I've certainly enjoyed working with Global Giving as sort of peer funders over the years. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how you see, you know, the funding landscape changing, and thinking about really transforming aid and philanthropy to accelerate community-led change through crowdfunding and powerful networks which facilitate relationship building. And I know that you'll be sharing with us a brief case study about Global Giving's COVID-19 response. So we'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Swati. I'm excited to be here with such a strong panel. Can I just make sure you're hearing me okay? Yes, that's great. So I'm not sure if Lena's going to bring up my slides. Thank you. I wanted to spend a few minutes to introduce everyone to Global Giving, just to explain how Global Giving is set up, and then we can go into the COVID-19 kind of cases, so that it makes sense to everyone how we've responded and why. So Global Giving's mission is to transform aid and philanthropy to accelerate community-led change. Everything we do is about this mission. We are a non-profit that supports other non-profits and provides tools, funding, training, and support to help non-profits serve the communities that they serve. Next slide, please. What we mean by community-led change. So for Global Giving, community-ledness is about being oriented to serve your communities and listen to them and respond to the needs. So like Purity said, responding to the needs of the communities. And sorry, got a frog in my throat for some reason. And last year, Global Giving partnered with the Global Fund for Community Foundation to do this participatory research around what it means to be community-led. And what we found is that they're more likely to be effective, more likely to be agile, and more likely to be long-term impactful. And that's because they're rooted in local knowledge, they're rooted in relationships and assets around them, and they are guided by community timelines and quality standards that they set for themselves. They also own the programs, so they're really invested in making them a success. So that's why we think that community-ledness is the right way to be doing philanthropy. The research is still ongoing, and there's a lot of opportunity to get involved. What I'll ask is for Lena to share the report and the webinar that's coming up for people to get involved, and also the survey if they want to get involved in the research. Community-ledness, we need to get on the same page about it, because it means a lot of things to different people. So I'm just going to leave it there for now, because that's a whole webinar on its own, and I don't want to go into too much detail there. Next slide. So how we do this, we are one of the first organizations that have done crowdfunding. We provide a platform for grassroots charitable organizations to share their work and for individuals to support them directly. We vet the organizations in advance and we help them to tap into their local communities for resources and support. And we basically train our nonprofits to identify their contacts, assign them, segment them, and tailor their messaging so that they can raise their local resources before becoming global giving partners. Next slide. Once they're on our platform, they get access to the ability to tell their story, get involved in match funding campaigns, network, training and support, and additional funding from corporates. Next slide. Once that's happened, it becomes a shopping experience for donors. Donors are able to explore the website, pick the projects that are their favorites, and just send money to them directly. And because we vet organizations thoroughly, we're able to make sure that small organizations get access to foundation funding, for example, that they wouldn't have the capacity to go through the grant making processes for. Next slide. And that means that within 24 hours after something like the Beirut explosion happens, we have a page up that tells people about what happened, and our partners have updated their projects on our website to make sure that people know how to help. And they can choose the projects that they want to give to. And because they're already set up on our systems, the disbursements can happen within a week or less even. So disaster response is one of the biggest programs that Global Giving does. Next slide. Yes, we work mainly with small grassroots organizations, but we also work with INGOs, especially in situations of disaster or areas where the INGOs are well set up with local partners already and they can support them. So they have their own projects on our website, but they also support the small nonprofits to create their projects on our website and get funding for themselves independently. Next slide. So for COVID-19, obviously everybody's been affected by COVID-19 and Global Giving is not an exception. But we were very confident that we could respond quickly and support our partners with this because we were already digital. While everybody else was trying to get on Zoom, was trying to get used to virtual training, we were already there. So while it was a challenging period, and it still is, we feel that we've been able to act quickly and pivot. And there were three imperatives that we focused on. One is the capacity of the most vulnerable organizations on our platform, because obviously everybody's capacity operations program funding was quite hit. Supporting the most vulnerable populations and communities that we work with, because obviously some communities have been impacted differently from each other. And obviously the do no harm principle is that we don't want to exacerbate the situation. So what we did was we asked our nonprofit partners, what do you need? Here are a couple of questions, answer these. We did a lot of the research, we did a lot of the vetting ourselves to make sure that we are sending the funding to the right places. But the fewer strings attached as possible was the way in which we approached it. And I think the underlying value that kind of underlies all of the work that we've done for COVID-19 is the listen, act, learn, repeat value of Global Giving. So we listen first to our community, we act, we test, we learn from that, and then we repeat, we go forward. And that enables us to act quickly and in an agile way. Next slide. So one of our first imperatives that I spoke about is supporting the most vulnerable organizations. And what we started out trying to do was we wanted to disperse 100 micro grants of $1,000 to those who needed them for things like gas, rent, things that they wouldn't necessarily be able to get a grant for. We quintupled that target, and we were able to raise 404,000. One was from one donor, one donation was from one donor for 100,000, and the rest was from individual and corporate donors. This is not, we've had a lot of other grants, so this is not all the grants that we've done for this particular micro hardship grants, but it gives you a sense of how we work. We put a project up there, and people are able to donate quickly and effectively. Next slide, please. Another initiative is to support the most vulnerable populations, obviously, and that's the COVID-19 Relief Fund. We were able to raise 9 million and disperse 6.2 million of that already through 8 grant cycles. And we're hoping that in the next few months, we'll be able to disperse the remaining 2 or 3 million. The types of projects, I'll let you read that slide for a minute. But yes, basically it's just the things that safe housing, food and nutrition, getting deliveries out there, PPE gear, it's, I mean, no surprise, raising awareness, but also mental health. And just a reminder that the power of crowdfunding isn't in the funding, it's in the crowd. This is one of my favorite quotes by our co-founder, Mari. And the idea is that global giving is a network, a community. And from the very beginning, our nonprofit partners build the relationships with their own community and then expand that network globally. So this gives us an exceptional approach of global in scope, but localized in nature. And I think that's what's helping us be so effective at channeling funding to those most in need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Soha. Is that the end of your presentation? Just wanted to make sure I hadn't cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That was so brilliant to kind of get a sense of just the evolution of global giving, but what that sort of technology, but also that community feel for crowdfunding has meant for responding to local organizations around the need and channeling money, to those groups that probably would be not getting funding from, other funders as easily in, this pandemic moment. I think it was a beautifully curated kind of walkthrough. There are a couple of questions that have come from the Q&As that I just wanted to see whether you could respond to. And so I think the first is just around, do you find that the actual local organizations that you work with prefer getting funding from global giving rather than maybe from institutional donors or via NGOs? And could you speak to any large donors who might use the global giving platform? And then a second question is around, someone, I think, Rose, who works for an INGO, and they work with a number of different local NGOs in their programming. And if you could just share again how you work with INGOs at Global Giving to sort of help them navigate this, this new landscape and wanting to get more and more funds direct to local communities and frontline organizations and movements. Sorry, and there's another question as well. If you did have a response, but just around, have you also engaged with maybe diaspora communities as well through getting fundraising with those communities that you might be able to speak to? Thanks, Soha.
No worries. I'm really sorry about this frog. It's making me quite nervous how I'm coming.
If you'd like to go get a glass of water, that's totally
fine. It's fine, I'll be fine, thank you. So I can't speak for the communities and nonprofits that we work with. Obviously, I believe that they would prefer getting donations from everybody and not prefer one to the other. we do get a lot of feedback from our nonprofits, and as far as we're aware, they do feel that we're accountable to them and we listen to them. And I think that's what they love about Global Giving, is that we are not only a way to access this funding, but also a community where they get on our network and share their learnings through our peer learning network webinars. This is one of the ways that INGOs support the work that we do. They are speakers on some of the webinars that we hold for peer learning, so they get to see and meet some of the local partners, and the local partners get to meet them as well. I struggle to say that they would prefer Global Giving to others, because I think they would love funding and support from any channels. As far as how we work with large donors, we have some grants at the moment from, for example, the National Lottery, and that is going to support the disability sector in East Africa. And we are working with the federations on the ground and several funders to work with disabled people's organizations, strengthen their capacity, the federations that serve them, and to test capacity building approaches that are community-led and funding approaches that are community-led. And that's a program on its own, and we deliver that work with others. What else? So there was a question on how we work with local INGOs as well. So that's mainly through our disaster relief team. They work mainly with them. The ones that I know of, at least. I'm interim, so I'm still learning about Global Giving and all of the wonderful things that we're doing. So the work that they do is a lot on researching and knowing more about our local nonprofits. So we look at reports when we're doing the vetting, and when we're looking at who we're giving grants to, we reach out to INGOs, and we read reports by them and by the sector, and we check websites, and we take the onus of kind of really understanding who our partners are and what their needs really are, so that we can support them. And the INGOs play a big role in kind of helping us where there are areas where we don't have that visibility. So that's a little bit more on that. I don't know about the diaspora communities. I do believe we do, but I don't have that answer. So I could provide the answer to whoever has asked it separately after this webinar. I hope that answers the questions.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much, Soha, for sharing those. There are a few more, but I think we'll bring those together in the kind of broader Q&A at the end of the call. I think also just, if I may, to respond to one of the questions just around whether people prefer getting funding from Global Giving over other donors. I mean, I can't speak to the Global Giving research, and I think you articulated that well, but I think what I would say is that from working within philanthropy, any funder who is giving unrestricted funding, that funding is like gold dust for any local organization, and it's definitely a preferred form of getting funding over anything that has much more restrictions in what organizations can do. And I think, to Purity's point at the beginning, it allows for that shift of power and that knowledge that actually local communities know how best, and those local organizations are best placed to respond to things. And I think we've all seen that within the COVID pandemic in particular, where things are shifting so rapidly, where there isn't, kind of stable plans that you can really make, because more and more changes emerge week by week, if not day by day, in communities. We're all recognizing more and more how important and how much more, like gold dust, that unrestricted funding is. So that would be just my addition to that question.
Agree completely. This is my experience from Egypt, from being on the ground with grassroots initiatives from Egypt. But I just didn't feel it was my place to be speaking for the nonprofit community. Do you know what I mean? Of global giving. But yes, definitely working with initiatives on the ground in Egypt, unrestricted funding was gold dust and much more preferred. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contributions, and looking forward to learning more from you later on the call. So going to move to our third and final panelist, the lovely Lucrecia Puentes from the START Network. Lucrecia she's got a really impressive work history, including as a Middle East emergency manager for Christian Aid, in child protection for the UNHCR, Save the Children, and the International Rescue Committee. And she currently works in program management, crisis anticipation, and risk financing for the START Network. So I think, Lucrecia, I'm really excited to talk to you. I think the START Network is such an interesting model of financing and has really emerged from INGOs themselves coming together and creating the vehicle of the START Network. And would love if you could share with us all just some of that early origin of those INGOs coming together to form the START Network. I know in our sort of prep calls, you also mentioned around that sort of movement on how the START Network was working more and more towards localization, and the shift to networks of networks to actually fund and offer different financial offerings. And also, I think some of maybe the new financing or networking of those different members, how they're organizing themselves to fund both within, this moment of COVID, but also maybe looking ahead to where they're seeing a need for financing changing the kind of landscape. So over to you, Lucrecia.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. You can actually call me Lucy. I think that's how most people know of me. I was looking through the participant list, actually, thinking we might see a few START Network member representatives in there. And I think I spotted Bob Ruxton, but other than him, I'm not sure how many people will be familiar with the START Network. So perhaps I could begin there just by saying that the network itself was set up, as you mentioned, by NGOs, and that was around 10 years ago. And the purpose of that organization that they did together was really to drive and catalyze change that was felt to be needed in the global aid system. They felt that doing that collectively as a group of organizations would be most impactful. And the focus back then, but also to this day, is really on systemic problems that afflict the international humanitarian sector as a part of the development sector. So maybe just to say sort of the reason for our focus and the areas in which we sort of concentrate is that we know that humanitarian action is persistently reactive and short term. It's really driven by political interest, by media headlines, and it's very slow often in reaching people affected by crisis. We also know that solutions to humanitarian impacts are often designed and developed far away from the front line by people who are disconnected sometimes from the communities that are actually experiencing these situations. And power, as it's been mentioned on this call already today, is disproportionately held by a handful of international entities. So local organizations lack direct access to funding, to decision-making, and to representation in many global forums. And I think this year, many of us have felt increasingly uncomfortable when we're receiving invitations to events and panel discussions that have no representation from the global South. But that discomfort, we don't often talk about that discomfort when we're thinking about behind closed doors where funding decisions are often being made. And yet, obviously, that's a part of the picture. The international humanitarian system's resistance to change is something that we have been struggling with for years, and those on the line who work in humanitarian action may well have experienced this directly. But this year, as you mentioned at the start, we're grappling with a climate crisis, an unprecedented humanitarian crisis with the coronavirus pandemic, and a social justice crisis that has been highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement. Many of us are perhaps realizing that we need to really confront and embrace the change that we've been talking about for a long time if we truly want to serve the people that are affected by crisis, which is, for many of us, the reason as to why we work in the sector that we do. So perhaps just going back to START Network's origins, as I mentioned before, 10 years ago, a group of British organisations came together to form something called the Consortium of British Humanitarian Agencies. That has now evolved into the START Network. And today we have more than 50 member organisations worldwide, and we have plans to further expand that membership, primarily among local NGOs, although we are also expanding with some international NGOs. The network is currently headquartered out of London, but it's transitioning to a global network of networks. And what that will look like is a series of hubs where power and decision-making authority will be centered, which will include London, but it will also include other hubs such as Pakistan, such as the Pacific, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Guatemala, and we hope to have future sort of hubs evolving in years to come. Locally led humanitarian action is really central to our theory of change. And I think this year we've really identified the fact that it cannot just be a pillar, it really has to be a broad approach that cuts across everything that we do and drives everything that we do at the network. So for our theory of change, we aim for more power and resources to be held by local and national organisations within our network, but we are also doing a lot of work to try to drive more funding and decision-making autonomy to local organisations across the wider humanitarian system. In terms of what we have observed to be challenging the NGO funding landscape this year, there are quite a few different factors at play. I've tried to distill a few. So firstly, need continues to grow. The COVID-19 pandemic has increased the global need for humanitarian assistance. As of October, total UN coordinated appeal requirements for 2020 had already reached $39.9 billion US. That's 34% higher than for the whole of 2019. Increasing humanitarian need brought about by the pandemic isn't just limited to the virus's direct health impacts, it's also compounding existing crises and inducing a global economic contraction. So the reaches of the pandemic, as we know, are far beyond what we've seen the last few months. They will be here for years to come, and we have to acknowledge that. When we talk of growing need, we also can't forget about the climate change and continued increase in frequency and scale of disasters, which is something that was very much at the top of the agenda as we came into this year, and we really cannot let that slip. Secondly, funding continues to be very reactive. The vast majority of humanitarian funding, estimated to be around 90%, is allocated to response activities. And we can group these under something called ex-post approaches. This is despite the fact that we know that there's value to early ex-ante approaches, so interventions before the fact. We estimate that around 55% of crises are somewhat predictable, and we believe that effective use of things such as predictive analytics, early warning information, pre-arranged financing, and other such interventions would allow NGOs, civil society, local governments to intervene well in advance of a crisis materializing. Similar in many ways to the way in which many of us might turn on the television, see a weather forecast, and react to that, bring the washing in, or do something similar. It's really just as basic as that, but obviously on a much grander, more complex scale. By acting before a disaster and responding early, we can mitigate or even prevent the impact of some crises from occurring. If we work in things such as crisis anticipation and risk financing, which many START Network members are already involved in, we have been able to demonstrate that we can act ahead of shocks or in response to triggers, and that has multiple benefits. We can do things such as curb food insecurity. There was a recent example of NGOs in Senegal receiving a payout, insurance payout of around $10 million US, which enabled a number of NGOs working within the START network to actually deliver assistance before food insecurity came about following a period of drought. We also believe that early interventions can do things such as protect lives, livelihood assets, and obviously build resilience. And there's a lot of emerging evidence that actually shows that early interventions can be more cost efficient than traditional response. More planned, predictable funding allows for more people to sit around a table in a country and to involve themselves in the preparedness and the planning for a response to a crisis. So there's more space there for civil society actors at a local level to drive the plans, to review and critique the intended actions, and to really participate in the entire emergency management process, more so than we see to be the case in a traditional response, where obviously something happens and there's a rush for action, and sometimes that action isn't necessarily as well planned in advance as we might have hoped it might be. However, this year, I should say, the START network, we have observed that many decision makers are hesitating to allocate the already scarce resources that are available for humanitarian action to anticipatory action. And the tendency remains to channel funding to people already affected by a crisis, where we already know that people have lost lives and livelihoods, rather than channel that funding in anticipation of a forecast crisis to protect those people from loss of life and loss of assets. Thirdly, power remains in the hands of a few. When crises occur and they make it into the headlines and onto politicians' agendas, NGO tendencies still remain to launch appeals. And these have been compared to begging bowls, with governments and donors at times resembling benefactors for a good cause and saviours coming to the rescue. I would encourage everyone to read the book Dull Disasters by Stefan Durkon and Daniel Clark, where they talk about this and how there are a slew of financial ways of managing crisis, tried and tested ways that could well be implemented in international humanitarian response. We know that many funding decisions continue to be taken far away from where crises are happening, and the crises that prompt discussion about funding tend to be from the more severe events, despite there being far more smaller events that occur and affect communities and obviously impact on development gains. The START network, we have something called the START Fund. It's, I guess, a flagship program that people may be familiar with. And this is quite unique in that decisions on where the humanitarian funding flowing through that fund go to is entirely determined by the member agencies themselves. So NGOs collectively make decisions on where funding should be allocated. And that funding can be allocated both to anticipatory action before the fact or for early response, so immediately following a crisis event. It's a pooled fund and a number of different donors support it. They tend to be European institutional government donors. But we have also started to do more work with trusts and foundations. I'll come on to that in a second. However, we have found that although NGOs have proven through the START network that they can self-organize and they have perhaps greater bargaining power by working together collectively, for fundraising, particularly for the Global START Fund, there are some challenges. Donors are asked to relinquish control and to put their money into a global pooled fund, and many of them have restrictions and don't necessarily wish to have NGOs lead that type of decision making. And also many of the NGOs that are part of the network, or just NGOs perhaps more broadly speaking, tend to perhaps hesitate when it comes to fundraising for such a mechanism. And I think the fundraising side of things for us tends to be driven internally by START team members. I guess the question that prompts is whether we as NGOs could move away from zero-sum thinking and harness the power of working together collectively in order to access and more efficiently access more funding for humanitarian action. And could we conceive of doing so in a context such as this year, where we're already facing a number of different restrictions on our own funding, and many NGOs are facing quite considerable economic hardship? Makes it all the more difficult. I could speak a little bit about the START network's response to COVID-19, but I think perhaps, shall I do that now, or would you prefer we do that?
I think maybe if you can weave it into a response to some of these questions, Lucy, if that's okay.
Of course.
That was a brilliant look at, I think, the START network's evolution. I think also, coming from a place of a humanitarian response and thinking about how so many funders have had to pivot to a humanitarian response this year with the pandemic, but also that evolutionary learning that you guys have had throughout, I think is really interesting, and love the sort of this idea about what does a balance of humanitarian response, but also anticipation and risk financing look like. And I think, would love to, I'm sure people on this call would also love to hear a bit more about the START Fund, so we'll allow you to sort of respond to that. I think some of the questions that are also coming through as well, and again, we might return back to these after this initial Q&A with you. But just, I think, one question that might be on a number of people's minds, especially within the bond membership, is just, do you think that something like the START network could actually be a blueprint for the future role of INGOs and help them actually transition their roles from from their current roles within the sector or space? And also, I think people are excited to hear when are the START hubs planning to start or open, and how might they work? And I think I'll come back to some of the other questions in the other Q&A, but if you could just respond to those, that would be great. And maybe weave in your other thought that you had.
Sure, I can try. Maybe just to say, in terms of, can the START network sort of offer a blueprint to other NGOs or to NGOs more broadly speaking? I think there are a number of different networks that are operating in both the development and the humanitarian space, all of which have slightly different values that they can offer to NGOs. Working in partnership, working in collaboration, working as part of a network definitely has advantages that it can lend to civil society actors. And one thing that I was quite keen to sort of touch on is, particularly for, I guess, an audience of primarily international NGOs based out of the UK, is how might we evolve? We know that we cannot remain as we are. We know that the current model for NGOs is being tried and tested and is shown to be wanting. And many NGOs are quite rightly looking internally and getting their own houses in order in the light of everything that's happening this year and everything that's coming really to the forefront of our attention. But looking outward is crucially important, and networks maybe offer one way in which NGOs can look outward and can try to harness that collective power of many entities working together. But partnerships and collaborations among NGOs, particularly with NGOs and local NGOs among them, and even with crisis-affected communities and community groups, is more powerful still, potentially. And that obviously, those conversations, one of my colleagues said, we have to be listening to understand, not listening to respond. We need to be having those conversations. We need to be coming to those conversations prepared to learn, prepared to change our ways of working. And that's where we potentially can get the most out of them. I think what the START network is aiming to do is quite bold and quite ambitious. It's a change-making agent, so it's not always presenting comfortable truths or comfortable possibilities to the network members, but it is testing things, and it is trialing and trying to be innovative around the way in which we approach things such as humanitarian funding. And none of what we do is the preserve purely of the START network membership. We put a lot of information out into the wider ecosystem that we hope other NGOs and other bodies will be able to pick up. So a lot of the work around anticipatory action through the START network has been shared with much bigger bodies such as OCHA. OCHA this year launched an anticipatory action framework through their country-based pooled funds, a number of country-based pooled funds. And we've seen recently a number of funding or allocation decisions made to release some of that money in anticipation of crisis events, such as I think recently we saw it in Somalia. So a lot of the work that OCHA is doing is drawing on some of the learning that we've had within the START network, and other organizations have had as well separately. So yes, it offers a blueprint, it offers learning, it offers different approaches. And that's definitely something that I think many NGOs could benefit from, at least just being aware of some of the developments in our space. Just to maybe touch on the hubs. So for us, the hubs is something we've been talking about for a very long time. We never wanted to be an organization or a network that was rooted in sort of London, with authority and decision-making and power sitting in the global north. We envisioned ourselves becoming a network of networks, with that power being better dispersed worldwide. We have already 5 hubs that are at various stages of development towards the objectives that they have set themselves. So we have got one in Guatemala, and we have others in India, Pakistan, the Pacific, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we have intentions to learn from the process that we've been through in realizing those 5 hubs and bring in new hubs in the future. So we intend to scale up that sort of trajectory towards this network of networks. There's lots of information that can be found on the START Network website about them, but those hubs are basically going to be the organizing structure for the network in the future. Hubs will be responsible for onboarding new START Network members, which will enable us to have more local agencies directly involved in all aspects of network management, decision making, and access and involvement in all the program side of things. So for example, with our Pakistan hub, they already have a number of local NGO members who've joined as START Network members, but specifically attached to that hub. And that's sort of the approach that we'll be taking forward. I wonder if I could just briefly touch on the work that we did around COVID-19, because I think it's possibly quite interesting to some people. Is that okay?
Yep, sure. We're sort of moving into the Q&A. I think if you want to do that as an opening, that would be fine.
Sure. Okay. So maybe just in summary, just in the weeks following the World Health Organization's announcement of COVID-19, the START Network membership came together and made a decision to launch something called Start Fund COVID-19. And it was really piggybacking off of that Global Start Fund mechanism that we've already established. For those who are perhaps less familiar with the Start Fund, it's a global pooled funding mechanism that really has its niche in responding to small, medium-scale crises that are under the radar. So the smaller ones that tend not to get funded through other funding mechanisms, perhaps, or perhaps not as quickly. Decision-making around that is all held with START Network member agencies. So Start Fund COVID-19 was launched on the 4th of April, and it's subsequently dispersed around £6 million, which is actually not as much as we had expected when we launched. Really, the value of launching the Start Fund COVID-19 from our perspective was it was fast. It was doing something that was trying to immediately respond to the identified needs that the NGOs that we work with were reporting to us. And so it was launched quite early on, and we managed to do so actually with the support of IKEA Foundation. What we found was that many of our government institutional donors did not pivot in time to support that fund at that early stage. Many came on board at a later point in time. And what we observed with the COVID work is that many agencies operated more in consortia, and there was an increase in partnership with local NGOs compared to what we typically see through the Start Fund. However, we did not see a considerable increase in the amount of local organisations directly accessing those resources, which is what we had hoped. Like I mentioned before, we found many traditional institutional donors were slow in pivoting to respond to COVID-19. Many trusts, foundations, high net worth individuals were much faster. They were on the front foot, and they were able to fund new initiatives in those first few months of the pandemic. Many government donors turn to traditional funding mechanisms such as country-based pooled funds or allocated resources through their existing NGO membership base. And there's lots of reports that are now going to be published, I think, in the coming few weeks on the funding picture. But perhaps just to say that of the almost $7 billion in humanitarian grants targeted to COVID-19 responses, that's both within the Global Humanitarian Response Plan and outside of it, multilateral organizations, particularly the United Nations agencies, were the largest first level receivers of funds, as we might have imagined they would be. And those entities channeled over 60% of the tracked humanitarian grants, equivalent to 4.1 billion US dollars. By comparison, NGOs have channeled just over 10% of that first level funding, equivalent to, it sounds like a large sum, but not in the grand scheme of things, but NGOs channeled 698 million US dollars. So they channel closer to 15% of first level funding, which we feel is not enough, especially considering how many local agencies were really working and operational and present in the communities affected by coronavirus at a time when many international NGOs had to withdraw their staff and slow down their operations. I'm going to stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that insight, Lucy. I think all the panelists in this discussion have offered such rich and quite different thinking and experiences and expertise just around how the funding landscape is changing overall. I think that there was, just going back to Purity's brilliant presentation and reflections, just I think really thinking about what does participation in communities look like, what's the onus on funders themselves in shifting power, in simplifying application mechanisms that actually get funding to communities, that center voices that aren't being centered at the moment. And I think also is inviting funders into being much more in deep dialogue with their communities and making sure that they're responsive to what communities need within that moment. I think, Soha, you offered some brilliant reflections just around the power of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, and that sort of mechanism in highlighting and lifting up the work of groups that are really small and local around the world, and what that means for individual givers, but also for INGOs and larger donors, and them getting funding to that route. And then I think, Lucretia, yours, which is sort of tackling the humanitarian space, which we know is, you know, deeply sort of driven by a lot of the bigger UN players you also mentioned, but some of the larger agencies in the world, and funding sort of not moving as quickly to communities, but also what the START network and NGOs collectivizing together has enabled for some of the learning. Would also just know that we have, I think, over 100 people on this call now. We have some questions that I'd love to dig into for our remaining time. We've only got sort of a couple of minutes for top line reflections from everyone, but would also encourage other people in the chat to maybe share other examples, their own examples or reflections on how their organization or what they've read about or seen is responding to the challenging NGO landscape. So I'm going to move to all of you to just share maybe final reflections as we close out the session, just because of time. So I think, first of all, going to you, Purity, I think there's a lot of interest from people within the question and answer. So I wonder if you could maybe respond to this within your closing remarks. I think a lot of questions around participatory grant making, but also how collectivizing of donors and bringing different donors together. How are you navigating risks for due diligence and donor worries? Are you actually, is With and For Girls or the Global Resilience Fund working with larger institutional funders, and making sure that, I guess, people want to know a little bit more about what's the funder take behind the scenes that allows for you to be able to respond in the way that you do. And I think some thoughts around what is your take on how you see the Global Resilience Fund shaping? You know, at the moment, you've done a great response to COVID, but what does this mean long term? And I think picking up on Lucy's point just around, you know, the impact of this pandemic is going to be felt for a longer time, and how should we be thinking about COVID responses as funders moving forward? So we'll go to you first for reflections, final reflections, then I'll move to the rest of you.
Thank you, Swati. And thank you for all the participants who've fielded these questions. So on the aspect of participatory grant making is definitely something that women's funds have been trying to work with the last couple of years, I would say maybe 20 years or so. And the idea, of course, comes from the feminist lens of just wanting to change how the world is organized, where half the time the groups that matter are consistently left out of the spaces that matter. So they are always being spoken for by other people. And I do know that a lot of women's funds like FECAM in South America, that really is one of the pioneers of this model, they started that wanting to actually change how we navigate that terrain, and also just recognizing that the groups that we work with, they do have their own power. And if we share that power, then we become richer. Our systems become better because they are getting insight from the funder and the grantees. So for me, I see it really as an old way that had not gotten the attention that it deserved. But now it's actually coming to play in a time where the world is actually, we are rethinking a lot of things, whether it's around how we manage our environment, the things that are leading to climate change, and what we can do to, change and be better human beings. There's a lot of reflection that's going on, and I do think that that's the part of the reason why the participatory grant making aspect is actually gaining quite some traction in this moment in time. How we deal with the risk for due diligence, for us, what we set out to do is actually seek to establish trust and operate from a place of trust. You can imagine, as a big funder, you trust a smaller organization with your funding. So for us, we just say the same model applies, that you're going to trust girls with our funding. And yes, even though they are unregistered, even though they don't have bank accounts and things like that, we are going to find ways to actually navigate what we call due diligence and find other ways of due diligence. And that due diligence for us, especially around our response to COVID, has been to listen to the panel and then to see who is it that has recommended this particular group to apply for funding. And that so far has been working really well. And we do hope that we continue to find new ways of actually demystifying what due diligence is. There was a question about which other large institutional funders who are funding us. Some of them are like the Ford Foundation, Wellspring. We have money from Chanel Foundation, and many others who just came on board and said, this is one initiative that is actually looking to center girls and young women in the response to the COVID pandemic, and they are willing to put their money behind what we wanted to do. So again, the conversation there has to be one of vulnerability and one of, again, seeking to build trust. Is saying this is the situation on the ground, and if we don't respond to it in the ways that the groups sort of need, then we will still be replicating what we've been doing over and over again. So as a grant seeker, I think there's that aspect of carrying ourselves with some bit of vulnerability and just seeking to build trust. And again, knowing we are always taking risks anyway. When we say to Ford, give us money so that you can give it to unregistered groups, we know Ford would not give money to an unregistered group based on how they're set up. but they are willing to trust us to do that. So again, just building trust and allowing ourselves to be less rigid in the way we function. I feel like I've taken all the time for the rest of the grantees. For the rest of the panelists, I'll stop here now.
Yeah, I would love to hear more from everybody, to be honest, but sadly time is not on our side. So thank you, Purity. I'm taking away from you is we need to think about trust with our communities and trust between the way that we're building collaborations between funders, and that penetrating to the way that we even think about risk and relationships. So thank you. Soha, would love to hear your kind of closing remarks, and particularly, I think, thinking about what are the future opportunities maybe with crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, and the learnings that you guys have learned through your time at Global Giving, but also through the COVID pandemic as well.
I can keep it really brief and build on what Purity has actually said. For Global Giving, we're obviously getting applications for relief for COVID. And what we're doing is we're asking a few questions, no strings attached, very minimal reporting required. And we've given out 6 million, hopefully 9 million by next year. And this for us is a new territory. We have never given that many grants with very little oversight before. And it's a huge learning for us, and there will be a lot of lessons that we'll be taking away from this and hopefully sharing with our peers and our sector. So this is the first thing that we're saying. We're testing these no barriers ways of funding our nonprofits, and also working with very small NGOs in a more capacity building approach. So we're taking a capacity building approach to due diligence, where we work with our small organizations to build them up to be able to send documents and all of that to bigger grant makers who require them. So I guess those are the two things. And the last one is give cash, not stuff. I think that's one of the main learnings of our disaster relief work, that if you give cash, people can use it the way they need it. And if you give stuff, a lot of it might go to waste and might not actually serve the people's needs. Yeah, and dialogue, listening.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Soha. And finally, Lucy, would love to hear some of your reactions. I think there's also some interest from people who might want to join the START network. So you might want to also respond by a link or something in the chat, but we'll pass to you for the final word.
No pressure. I actually think that what Purity in particular has had to say on this call is really worth listening to. The future of humanitarian and development is very much locally driven. And I think those of us who've worked with international NGOs, particularly UK-based NGOs, really need to adapt if we want to survive. Truth be told, there's simply not enough resources flowing to sustain these big, very top-heavy international NGOs anymore. And furthermore, if we think about the purpose, our humanitarian missions or development missions that we intend to sort of work towards, the way in which we're currently doing business is no longer fit for purpose. There are better ways that are emerging, and I think it's very interesting to think about all of the innovations that are proving to be impactful and that are proving to be value for money. And perhaps British NGOs and other NGOs worldwide need to reflect upon their de facto approaches to development and humanitarian, and to really have some difficult internal conversations off the back of everything that's happened this year about whether that approach that they continue to embrace is necessarily the right one for the world as it's evolving and as it's emerging. I think British NGOs have quite considerable power with donor bodies, but perhaps that power could be better harnessed if we worked collectively and if we work through networks or collaboratively. We could be bargaining a little bit more. We could be asking for sort of better conditions for our partners in terms of ICR rates and in terms of how we work in partnership, true partnership. And I think there's a lot of really amazing things that are actually happening and initiatives and efforts underway already that I could point to. But I would suggest that that we really all have that internal reckoning, and we work with local actors to try to understand what our role in the ecosystem may be in years to come.
Wonderful. Thank you. Brilliant words to end us off. I think everyone has given such beautiful, articulate reflections. And I think so much of it speaks to deep trust and dialogue with communities. Communities are the ones that are responsive. They listen, they build trust, they collectivize and collectively bargain for discussions. And they're the ones at the forefront of what's happening in this pandemic, but throughout development. And I just want to thank these three amazing speakers, Purity, Soha, and Lucy, for their incredible reflections, and to the Bond Network. Thank you all for joining. Lena has put an evaluation form into the chat. If you do have a moment, please click through and just respond to that. It will really help Bond in thinking about events moving forward. But just happy Tuesday to everyone. Thank you all for joining, and thanks to the panelists in particular, and to Lena, Yoli, and Zoe for all their work in the prep beforehand. Thank you.